Hey guys, we're back. Hey Harry, how are you?
Hi
It's,
Nilanjan, good to meet you and good to be back on
yeah,
the
it's
Dev
always good
podcast.
to have you here. It's always good to have you here. I wanted to have Derek as well, but see, he got stuck with an emergency. But it's going to be a fun discussion. So last time when we spoke, it was tail end of last year, I believe, right? We made a bunch of predictions, so we should revisit those. Those would be fun. But I know we talked about spec driven development. I mean, I'm not saying that was early, but it was kind of building. That whole product was building. And now I saw you posted an interesting article on InfoQ. Let me see if I can share my screen here real quick.
Sure.
Where are you, InfoQ? So it's always difficult to. Okay. Yeah, so interesting article about InfoQ about spec driven development. So I think it'll be interesting to sort of step back and talk about this a little bit because what caught my attention is this whole enterprise scale adoption, right? So can you take us walk through like what's happening in your world? Why should we be talking about spec driven development?
Yeah, again, maybe just to take a step back in terms of the timelines, right, and how I
Hmm.
got into this whole idea. So last year, February was when pretty much the vibe coding term itself was coined. It's not even been a year, and it's already like vibe coding is being thrown under the bus technically, saying it's not the best thing to do. You should be doing a little bit more in terms of being able to plan for what you're building. And
Mm.
predominantly, the biggest prime mover for spec-driven development, at least from my point of view, and why should
Mm.
enterprises care about it? That came from the point of view where the model started having longer spans of attention, where they could do focused work. And technically, you're measuring models' capability by saying, you could do 30 hours of work uninterrupted and whatnot. While those are like fancy numbers to think about, that's the
Uh-huh.
reality also, right? If you think
Right.
about it, in terms of like any enterprise, if they are only able to like just do back and forth chat, and
Mm.
that's engineers just doing at a single person level, improving their own productivity, that feels a little trying to shoehorn AI productivity into existing models. So for me, when I look at this article, if I may share my screen, the way I approached it was lastly to, let me just pull it up here. So my approach to, uh, share, is my screen visible already?
Oh, I need to give you permission. Try again.
Yeah, I have done it. Or maybe if you can share, I'll just walk you through it. That's all.
Okay, let me work. I saw a prompt. I accepted it. I don't know what happened.
Yeah,
All
I
right.
think we're good already. So we're sharing screen.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So cool. So primarily, I think there's two things, right? Spectrum development gained a lot of traction last year around the mid-year
Sorry.
timeframe.
Sorry, Harry. Harry, step back. Step back. Let's define for. There will be some new audience in here. But define that term for us. Well, what do you mean by that? Spec-driven development.
Okay. So spec-driven development largely is about being able to break down what you're building with the AI, collaborate with it to articulate your intentions as
Mm.
specifications, and then eventually have that drive the rest of your application building. So right
Mm.
now, I think you're highlighting the workflow of a plan mode, right? So maybe if you can
Yeah.
scroll up, I don't know if it's my screen or yours. So maybe,
No.
yeah,
No.
yeah, right there.
This.
So I'll just walk you through this. So vibe coding,
Yes.
just to define what is vibe coding, right? It's no
Mm.
look coding. So that's what we talked about last time. And in this diagram, what we're trying to say is here there is no artifact in terms of what is context, right? Basically,
Mm.
we just prompt with a single, like, we just hope that we get the right application back on
Yeah.
assumptions. And that app becomes the center of your
Yeah.
discussion further. That is the context as well as
Right.
the spec and the code,
Right.
everything all in one. You keep iterating on top of it
Mm.
and hope that it will get to a point where you're going
Right.
to ship it. Now, this is
Right.
not, again, very instructional form of working with the agent or the coding agent itself, right? And then came the plan mode, which became like very, very productive in the sense that at least
Yeah.
you were able to do a little bit of upfront dialogue with the agent, and that way you did not completely depend on the built artifact as a way to iterate. You could course correct the agent even before it started writing the first line of code, so that you don't have to like just
So
hope and pray that it works.
yeah, it's also deep. And just to add to that is, I mean, nothing wrong with this approach if you're building sort of one shot, a small app or solution, right? Hey, just script, build a nice dashboard for me, or summarize this for me. This is still fine. But I think what you're trying to get at is that when you're building something reasonably complex, you have to sort of use this plan mode, right?
And it's also, I think it's a very good point which you brought up. The reason why you need this is more about sustained development, right? If you're building something to put in front of your investor, or you're trying to get your first set of users, you probably are better off trying out like vibe coding, or just plan mode. Just build something quickly and get it validated.
True.
But thereafter you want sustained development going on from there. That's where like you need a process or some sort of method to handle this menace of where is the context, who understands what the code is. So that's where, like, if you scroll down, what spec driven development further does is you have a little bit of a discovery exercise with the agent, and so far the instruction or the conversation between us and the AI was very instructional, right? I say, I want this, build this for me, right? Versus what if we make the AI, like give the AI the seat at the table rather than making it a tool on the desk. So, and then have that go back and forth with us, and it becomes a conversational dialogue. Like, are you sure you want to build this? These are the things you need to be aware of, and let's break this down and understand it from the point of view of, number one, what is your business criteria, how you want to build it in terms of technicality, and then eventually the task list. Of course, people might say that this looks like a little bit like waterfall, but that's not really it. The point is how you and I would work with each other if you're building features incrementally. We discuss it between us. So for me, spec-driven development is largely about the conversational model or the dialogue that it promotes between human and AI. And eventually in the enterprise context, it's not just about one person talking to the AI, right? It's a team of human engineers ideating and then directing a swarm of agents. So that kind of complex setup with long execution times and whatnot requires a sophisticated, context building, if you so to speak. And that's what is spec-driven development. So to come back to your question.
So to my understanding then is that, so I'm still stuck here. I'm being very transparent with you, right? And we talked about this too. I extensively use plan mode. I have my own process and method. Obviously, it only works for me, and it works because I have a very small team. So I understand my methods will not scale in large context. So if I take a map of this, what you have done is that you essentially broken down the plan mode into discover, design, and task phase, right? Is that what's happening?
Yeah, there's a lot more nuance to like the plan phase, right? Like you actually said. And in fact, when we spoke last time, you asked what is the difference, and we were talking about plan being a perishable artifact. We don't really keep it afterwards. Versus spec is a first-class citizen, where the decisions which you're making along with the AI is captured as the document, and the document survives that coding session and becomes probably one of the primary artifacts based on which you further write code. So technically, the primary difference being the plan is a tactical artifact which is perishable, versus spec is a more permanent artifact which is more important than the code itself technically, because you could theoretically regenerate the code from the spec.
True. I mean, I've been into that too. I mean, maybe we should talk about that too down the line, saying like, when the Git was designed, the world of programming was very different than now. I completely agree with you. If I can get your specs, it really doesn't matter. And we're seeing this happening already. The new type of libraries coming out. I mean, imagine a software library or a package that you're downloading. All that package has is a spec file. And all you have to do is that the future of software distribution is going to be just include that, just point your Claude to the spec, and Claude will generate that library in whatever language you want. It really doesn't matter, right? That's sort of the future we're heading to.
Yeah. I think just to add to that point, I was talking to the maintainer and creator of OpenSpec, It's a popular spec-driven development tool on which I'm also a maintainer. And he was talking to me about, he mentioned about this library called Venwords, or a Git repository, which became quite popular. And which is
Yes,
exactly
right.
like what you said. It's literally a spec. It doesn't have the code. It generates like the word date, and I don't have to distribute a library for it. I'm just how does it behave, and that's pretty much that. So, like I think in future you could technically ship software as what
So
exactly is.
imagine this, right? If you're building an utility library that could be used by any programming language, it was painful for authors before, right? And Apache and all other had to go through. There is a Java version, there is a .NET version. Now you just write one universal spec, and the language sort of becomes like an implementation details you don't have to worry about. So
Correct.
this is one fundamental change. I like this. This fundamental change happening is that as a developer, we sort of gradually moving up the ladder a little bit, right? Up the food chain and focus more on the spec. It really doesn't matter which language or how it's getting implemented. The spec becomes a very important artifact.
Precisely, and I think a lot more complex software is also being shipped. For example, OpenAI recently launched Symfony, and Symfony itself is just available to you as specs, and you don't really have like actual code being distributed. And yeah, so this diagram.
Let's make this real then. Sorry. So let's say you said enterprise. So let's take a classic enterprise example. So obviously lots of enterprises now have lots of brownfield projects. Which might not be test driven, might not have good amount of documentations around them. Maybe I'm putting you on the spot here, but they want to adapt AI, right? And obviously my method of just open Claude Code, plan and build something and ship it's probably not a good advice for them. And they want to add, how can companies get started with this?
That's excellent point. In fact, enterprise, the primary point is nobody starting from scratch, right? You don't have the luxury of saying, I'm going to start writing code from scratch and I'm going to use spec, drive it from specs. But there is a nice analogy which I sort of stumbled upon recently. So you and I, Nilanjan, we go back to the time when most of us were practicing test-driven development. And out there in the field, people never wrote tests. And we were like, how do you do TDD on a piece of code that does not have tests? Right? And if you recollect the book by Michael Feathers, which is working effectively with legacy code, the definition of legacy code is singularly about code that does not have tests to begin with, right? And drawing a parallel from that for spec-driven development, my take now is that code that was written without specs driving it by agent or by humans is brownfield project, right? And that's majority projects.
That's a good one, yeah.
It's an enterprise, you don't have specs existing. So where do I begin? And that's where, like, for most of them, that's a challenge. And in fact, today, a popular search term, if you go and look for what people are searching for, is how do I reverse engineer specifications from the existing code and then go from there? The answer to that, again, goes back to Michael Feathers' book. So if you think about the name called characterization tests, people who would remember that test, right? Which is...
define that for others.
Yes. So characterization tests, if you have a piece of code which does not have any unit tests, but you want to test drive a bug fix on it, what do? If I go and fix a bug on it without understanding the code base, I could inadvertently break other things, right? So what I do is I cordon off the area of change which I need to do. I cover that area alone with unit tests to establish what is the current behavior, bug and all, right? So that I have fully understood the code base and captured my shared understanding of that code base as a test. And the test characterizes that behavior, the existing behavior, and seals the current behavior. Now on top of it, I can do TDD in that small capsule, right? And then as I keep on building up this practice, over time, there will be test coverage for the code. So I'm literally being a good scout, so to speak, right? Similarly, for spec-driven development also, or for AI coding for that matter, when you're adopting in brownfield, I don't think a big bang upfront reverse engineering to spec is worth it, right? Because it's just impractical. It's not impractical because it's not possible. It's just impractical due to human limitations, right? I simply cannot fathom reviewing 100 pages of Markdown, which
Yeah.
probably the system has put out, and I don't know how to validate the correctness of it or the
Yeah.
accuracy of it. Which is where
Yeah.
I feel, again, to answer to your question, just incrementally build up the spec
Mhm.
and start adopting. What I'm trying to call out is your brownfield project. The existing code is the true source of truth context. Let's use
Yeah.
that as a way to incrementally build up and move forward. And that's a
Yeah.
big point there. I think the spec fall, which we wanted to cover, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah. So again, if you the point is like in enterprise, if we look at spec-driven development largely
So
as a yeah,
no, no. I was just I was just trying to make it concrete here.
yeah,
So yeah. So let's say the workflow typically is still going to be in legacy world, right? I know lots of product managers are start using Cursor and they're trying to build a workable app these days. But let's say either way, I mean, you are getting some specification. It could be an executable app, could be a PRT document, right? Just walk us through like in high level what your workflow looks like these days, because I know you actively use spec-driven this process, right, when you're building your software. So you got a requirement from your product manager. Walk us through like how you unpack that using this method.
got it. So typically, I think in the context of enterprise, people are still already invested heavily into their Jira boards or Asana or Linea. It's
Yeah,
already there.
sure.
The backlog is there. I
Yeah,
don't want to say that, hey, shun all of it, and then you want to start living in the code base in your Git repos. That's not going to happen on
yeah,
day one. So
yeah,
my
yeah.
current workflow is still heavily integrated with their current tooling, in the sense
Okay.
that so this is a typical OpenSpec change creation workflow.
Okay.
So OpenSpec or any other tool for that matter, when you pick it up,
Sure.
you start with proposing the change, and you take that change, create like the
What
markdown
is that?
files
What
for.
does that look like? It's just a document, proposed change.
Yeah, so basically what you see there, the second block, the gray block over there, which
Oh, I
says
see.
a proposal.md, a task.markdown, and specifications, and the area of change and what it actually contains, right? So I
Yeah.
would start building a product catalog. So I would say, hey, I am building the
Mm.
catalog page, and I want such and such pagination, and I want such and such scroll or whatnot. So, and
Right.
then I detail it out. What's the design here? All of those decisions are made. And then eventually I break it down into technical decision. Is it like a front end, back end? Is there an API in between? How does that look, etc. Then I further break it down
Mm-hmm.
into task list in terms of how I want to build it. Do I
Mm-hmm.
want to go sequentially, or do I want to build the back end first, the front end first? Those mechanics are decided. And these all decisions are captured as Markdown files. And then ultimately, that's what I give it off to a swarm of agent or an agent to say, go build them and come back to me. And hopefully, because I've done all the upfront, steering in terms of how I want to do it in terms of detailing, the final product is not going to be too far off from where I want it to be, right? And then I could incrementally steer it towards where I want. So that's the nature of basic spec-driven development. In the
Okay.
enterprise context, where I start with proposing that change itself in terms of what is a spec, is usually a
Mm.
Jira ticket or something which is appearing in my board. That
Right.
becomes my starting point. And then
Mm.
from there, I go on to say, hey, now let's detail this out in terms of what a developer is going to do. So, for example, that's like a kickoff exercise, if you will, right? You take up a story from the Jira board and then you task it out. You say, this is all I want to do. And then maybe you have a huddle with your team. If you were the engineer, you would do that. So that's exactly what I'm having as an exercise with the AI coding agent. That, hey, let's go back and forth, understand what is your mode of operation for completing this task, and then I'll let you go. Then you go build it
So
for me and come back.
this will also probably going to involve like a designer, maybe an input could be a Figma design, a product engineer, all that sort of teaming up and having discussions right here, right? When you're drafting
That
the
is
proposal.
correct. That is correct. So in fact, what we do is that is one step before this, because
Yeah.
OpenSpec or spec-driven development tools are largely living inside the current Git repository level. So what I
Mm-hmm.
am currently practicing is, can I do something at the board level? So if you scroll down in my article, I integrated with the board
This
itself,
one right
like
here.
if you see the backlog. Yeah. So here what's happening is I'm fetching issues from the backlog. and only then I'm further cleaning it up and detailing it. But in the backlog itself, I have like it have it integrated, let's say, with a Claude desktop project, so where the
Right.
designer could say, hey, here's a first feature from the product owner
Mm.
that's come up,
Mm.
and then the designer can go in and say, hey, these are the designs I want to add from Figma or something. And then the
Right.
architect already has their guidelines based on which the story could be split into sub issues to say, here's the front end side, there's a back end side, this is the database design. That becomes sub stories. And then each engineer from, like, whatever discipline they are, they pick up each of those individual pieces and run with it. So that's the next diagram you will see in the article, which kind of shows you how you're splitting it up. So that's one use case where the product owner is talking about the business use case in terms of the feature. The
Yeah.
architect, the architect persona, which is created as an agent, is the second swim
Yeah.
lane that is breaking the story down based on technical guidelines into a
Yeah.
front end and a back end item. But of course, in a realistic scenario, that story would be split into many more sub items. And then
Yeah.
individually, that one sub item would still further get detailed by the people involved. So at the
Mm.
backlog level itself, we try to handle the people coordination. And then from there, when it comes down, it actually goes into the code repo. So that's the artifacts part on the left hand side.
So, so at the surface, I'm just being honest. I don't. I know it's not true, but I'm encouraging you to answer this. Feels
Yeah.
like, oh, this is a very heavy-handed processes, old school. I understand why you get the waterfall reference. But this whole thing could be an half a day exercise or even lesser than that, right? I
It's
know this image
probably,
looks like a lot of work,
yeah,
but it's not weeks or months. We're talking about days here, right?
it's probably even 30 minutes of work, if I'm not
Mm,
wrong.
mm,
But what
mm.
we're talking about here, if you see, is that architect is not like a real person. It could be the architect agent. The
Yeah,
architect is training the agent to do what their work would be, right? So I
yeah,
think there's a popular study recently that a majority of the work that people are doing in large teams is
yeah,
largely about people coordination job, right? Just transferring knowledge which I don't know about. So if I once I start encoding it into an agentic harness to say, hey, this is the architect agent, this is a design agent, this is all of these
yeah,
people, I'm
yeah,
tuning my agent harness to
yeah,
say once a story comes into that pipeline, it's not the
yeah,
real people who are like sitting in a room huddling and doing this. It's the
yeah,
agents which are breaking the story down into
yeah.
all of these pieces, and then there are other agents going and picking up and running with it. So it's technically what you're
So,
doing is
so
you're
in this,
assembling a factory.
this is, yeah, I see. I got you. I got you. So this is a human. I'm assuming the developer who is
Yeah,
orchestrating this, and the product owner is obviously the product engineer. Everything else is sort of
correct.
agents managing here. Okay.
Pretty
So
much, pretty
that's
much.
interesting. This is so your set of architecture is obviously this is spanning multiple repositories, probably, right? Projects. There
Correct.
might be a front end project. It could be. Uh, is this then? Are you designing? Sorry, I'm getting into a little bit details, but I think it's worth it to understand. Is it
Absolutely.
so? Is typically your projects are the but in legacy it cannot be. So enterprises, it's multiple repositories. It could be spanning into 10, 15 maybe repositories based on how complicated your solution is. So that means you typically have an agent orchestration layer. Is there a specific tool you use for that?
So that's currently more or less trying to put together, your agents within projects such as Claude
Hmm.
Desktop is what I'm primarily using for it.
Okay. Okay.
Otherwise, I have like other repositories in which I have agent markdown files,
Okay.
primarily just driven by markdown, and that is doing my
Okay.
orchestration. And
Okay.
either I use like something like a GitHub action, which picks up items from the Linear board or the Asana board, does the
Okay.
orchestration. All of
Okay.
these is largely Markdown. And if
Okay.
you scroll down further and you look at the next diagram, that is the overall harness itself. Like if you further down, yeah, yeah,
There's more.
this is the ultimate diagram, so to speak. Sorry to sort of make it sound like the ultimate diagram, but really speaking, what you're trying to do here is on the left hand side. Today, you have a physical human team trying to have a collaboration model in terms of how
Yeah.
they build stuff, right?
Yeah.
Now that collaboration model is what you want to encode into a spec-driven development workflow.
Yeah.
My opinion, just because multiple tools out there, I don't think the tool should be driving what your workflow is, right? So
Yeah.
the spec-driven development workflow of
Agree.
what is whether design, what is the technical architecture, how you're breaking this down, how many people it's going across or agencies going across, that workflow is
Yeah.
something that's customized for you. And then that will get intent into specification. So again, that's where I feel like the term intent engineering is a little bit more relatable rather than saying
Yeah.
context engineering. The whole game here is how effectively you can articulate intentions through specification.
So,
And
all
then
right,
that,
let's go into that.
yeah,
I think this is sort of very important diagram here. There are a couple of things that I've noticed in all this diagram that I want to highlight. Obviously, we should talk about intent or / context engineering a little bit. Then we'll come back to which is where I spend most of my time. This is worry about is how do I know that stuff that produced at the end of this pipe here works, right? I mean, I mentioned it all before also. I think human doing peer reviews is not scalable. I don't think that's a solution here. So we'll come back to that. So let's first talk about intent, the context. Now, down the line, let's say I'm following the spec-driven development here, and I've ended up with lots of specs. And like you said, spec is my documentation, right? It encodes the behavior of my app. Now, context is in short supply, right? That's the limited resource you have. So now you're going back, let's say, refactoring an existing feature that you already built. How you do context engineering in terms of like you have maybe hundreds of spec files. How do you load that spec to the context so that app knows? You see what I'm saying? Like how do you bootstrap the context so that it can fix a problem?
That's a great question. So first of all, the whole idea of specification is not to create like one big requirements document, so to speak, because that is the antithesis of what we're trying to do, right? The whole specification itself is a hierarchical beast, if you think about it. You're trying to say what is the overall business context, you're building up to it. You're also trying to say each of the features, like, what is this? Like, if you think about domain-driven design, you have the bounded context. Each bounded context has further detailing inside of it. You have this sort of tree-like structure, right? And that's what I look for when I'm looking for a spec-driven tool and the spec format. Does it encourage a tree structure? And the tree structure necessarily allows me to say, if I'm particularly refactoring or cleaning up a certain area, then I can go down to that particular section of the tree, pluck out the few leaves that I need, and then you be able to use that to give targeted context to the agent.
So this is what I mean. This is what you mean by the tree, right? Your spec is, so this is not a one file. This is like a folder that contains the structure.
That is correct. So what you're pointing at, Neil, is a single change proposal, right? Like, for example, I'm trying to change it from, let's say, a pagination to a infinite scroll. That's a single change. But then what you notice is eventually there is a merge. In case of OpenSpec, at least, what happens is after I finish development, it gets merged into something called the source of truth specifications. The source of truth specification is a top-level artifact which contains a summary of all the features that I have in my application, and it's a, so to speak, information, right? From which I can pick and choose what area I need to be working on and select that information and make that context available for the next one.
This is good. I mean, we should have talked about this. No, I'm impressed in a way that, so one fundamental problem with back in days, we never used to, I see a documentation because documentation will always go stale, right? Code's going to evolve. Nobody's going to remember to go back and update the wiki. But sounds like OpenSpec has this process now. Every time you're making any sorts of changes, it's sort of there. It's part of the process that it goes back and updates the source of truth.
That is correct. And the whole idea of spec-driven development, in fact, is you're starting with the spec, right? And you're developing you're building the code from it. So the implementation comes from the spec and not the other way around. Right. In the past, the doc would go stale because the doc was always a after the fact artifact,
right? Byproduct, totally.
Byproduct. So here the spec is the first class citizen, and the code is a byproduct. Is what I would say. What's
Yeah,
happening,
that's
and
true. Very true. It's good stuff.
yeah,
So I understand. So it's organized by source of truth. As a developer, when you try to fix it, you sort of go to that repository, wherever that's stored. It really doesn't matter. You pick the right spec or specs, group of specs, bootstrap your context, your Claude or whatever coding agent you're using. Now suddenly your context is loaded with all the knowledge, and the agent can go fix it. That's a beautiful process. Now let's talk about the last part in here, which is maybe it's gaps in learning. So obviously, how this validates step a little bit. So I'm
yeah.
assuming part of your spec is obviously you generating automated test suites. How you validate your product?
Yeah, so basically that's the hardest problem in this whole equation, right? In terms of you're
Mm-hmm.
taking natural language and you don't know what is the deviation between what is the intention,
Yeah.
articulated in your natural language to what is being written in the code. So
Mm-hmm.
each tool here takes a different process. So for example, there is Tessel. There's a tool called Tessel, which is quite popular, and they have a very interesting approach of having almost a file-to-file match. To say the spec itself generates like test cases, it includes test cases to validate back to say that whether the code that is written is actually according to the spec at all, right? So that's number one. That's one way of approaching it. The other way of approaching it is I could do an out-of-band test. What I mean by that is the spec generates the code, but then independently I have another agent read the spec and generate a test case which can try validating whether that code is behaving according to the spec to see if there is any deviation. And the third approach is probably a little loosey-goosey, which probably says, can I have an LLM go and probabilistically determine if the code is,
Yeah,
in line with the
like
spec?
an LLM as a
But
judge.
LLM as a judge. But
Mm.
my experience, at least my experience, is that for the large part, there are gaps in validation. I don't think
Yeah.
it really
It's
is
my
like it's
biggest
possible.
concern. I've been trying some methods now where so I haven't. I mean, this is a type of tool that I want to build if I get some time on weekends. Is sort of auditing. The big problem I have is that models tend to cheat a lot. I mean, it takes shortcuts. I mean, it's a nature. I feel like even if I use that for generating tests and all sorts of probes to make sure it's working correctly, it's gonna invariably figure out, reverse engineer what's the quickest way to make this go green.
It's reward hacking its way to
Yeah.
these things.
Exactly. So I've been thinking about. So I've started using something that I never felt need of, which is a mutation testing. I never felt the need of. You know why? Because we always test drove it. I know exactly it works. Now I've been exploring tools like mutation testing, which sort of flips bits in the code and sees where the failures is happening. All that stuff, just to get a little bit of confidence around that, hey, my product really works. The test suites are properly testing correctly. But I agree. I mean, this is a whole new problems fundamentally have shifted here right now.
In fact, since you mentioned mutation testing, I also recollect Kiro
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
popularized or rather brought back the property-based testing PBT.
Oh, I still love that.
So
Love that. Hmm.
basically using the spec as a feature and deriving
Mm.
properties from it and thus generating tests based on that to verify and
That's
validate, right?
that
But again,
itself would be enough for me to switch to this.
yeah,
If that convincingly, I will definitely explore this. Obviously, I think that's a really, really smart way to think of it. The specs could be turned into executable properties tests that we can run to sort of end-to-end validate this. Just going to unlock so much opportunities here. So that's
yeah.
really, really cool.
But a sort of hot take here from me, right? Which is,
Yeah.
I've been wondering and like worrying about validation myself for the longest of times. But
Yeah.
for me, the bigger point with spec-driven development is not about achieving that, perfect alignment and like, having that code be perfectly clear.
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
you think about it, even human to human interaction, no matter how well you articulate to me, I'm going to still mess up and have some one or two things which are not according to what you said. And then
Yeah.
we talk about it and we fix it and we try to figure out what went wrong in that conversation, what did not elicit that requirement clearly enough so that I missed it, and maybe we put a system in place. So in future,
Yeah.
when you communicate something, I don't miss those points, and then I course correct and I fix the system between us.
Yeah.
And I look at LLM pretty much behaving exactly like people. So what I
Yeah.
feel is, at least again, this is anecdotal. I don't see
Yeah.
very many mistakes with agent as much as like people.
Yeah.
It's pretty much
No,
on
no.
par is what
Yeah.
I feel. So in that case, if going to be mistakes, I'm not going to be like, I have solved validation, so I don't need to worry about it,
Yeah.
issues. And in that case, then I don't
Yeah.
try to fix the probabilistic nature of it, which is what it is. I don't want to go against the current there.
Yeah.
Now, what if I
Right.
instead
Mhm.
fix the system so that I can reduce
Yeah.
the deviation right up front? And that's
Yeah.
the whole thing about that
Yeah.
harness, the harness
Yeah.
feedback loop diagram, which was basically.
Yeah.
That's my
Yeah.
take. Again, I'm still forming my thoughts around it, but I
So
feel.
yeah, so there are a couple of issues I do find is since agent is driving most of the code generation for me, I feel like back in days I used to know how this application works. When I was part of any team, I knew sort of ingrained how the system is behaving and work, right? Since we move a couple of abstraction level higher now, I mean, I do feel like that tech lead sometimes, Ivory Tower sitting tech lead, which doesn't write code that much, directs. I still have an idea of how the app, you know what I mean, right? So since
Yeah.
I'm distant, more and more we are going away farther from the code, it's gonna, that retaining that knowledge of how this whole application works. Because every time I start refactoring now, my first command is always, can you reload the context and tell me how this flow is working? Because I can't retain all this, right? This always strikes me as a, hey, dude, I used to be good at this stuff. And this is showing up too. I mean, I think another downside of LLM-driven programming is that, and Anthropic did the study too, lots of developers are losing the ability to how to debug code properly.
Yeah. The only analogy I remember is there was a study done on London cab drivers. So the old days, the London cab drivers, they learned the routes manually. They had a
Yeah.
very concrete part of that brain which was highly overdeveloped in taxi drivers, where the maps were
Interesting.
pretty much ingrained. Versus
Yeah.
when people started using navigation aids, and that part of
Yeah.
the brain sort of reduced and overcompensated by some other area. So I guess just adding to what you
Yeah.
said, maybe we lose that ability to technically debug, but probably compensate for it in some other area.
Yeah.
Because I find this whole AI coding very tiring. I'm doing 3-4 hours a day probably, and I find it extremely tiring because I'm constantly in the decision-making chair,
Yes.
rather
Yes.
than the joy of coding is.
Very good point. Glad you brought that up. I mean, it's very exhausting. It almost feels like back in days when I used to do pair programming for 8 hours, and it gets exhausting end of the day, right? It doesn't. We don't have Slack anymore, right? Slack is
Correct.
not built in. Yeah. Yeah.
So it's kind of difficult, but we don't know. If you ask me, am I comfortable at all saying that I don't know the code? At least for the past quarter or so, I have not written any code myself by hand.
Yeah, me neither.
And I'm thinking this is becoming constantly the battle. I do read the code, but I've not come to that level of confidence to say I don't look at my code and I ship it.
That's why I've been very focused on building an auditor for so we are automating things. We are giving lots of responsibility on validators, validating stuff. I am sort of moved to the next stage of who is auditing the validator sort of stage. So you're right. I think the spec is fixing a problem for me, which is, you're right. If the plan is really good, most of the time this coding tools does a really good job. I mean, we are past that point. Models are really good at this now. So spec is helping all of us. I'm just kind of trying to summarize what I learned from you today. Spec-driven is sort of helping us to making sure the plan seems reasonable, concrete. So that's really good. And we sort of push the problem to validate stage a little bit now, which is now just to ensure that it actually did because models, again, it's reward hacking, like Harry said. It will say that I'm done, but when you go back and check, you see that they had missed some really important validations. There's still up for grabs now. If anybody has really good ideas, I'm going back to old sort of testing books like mutation testing, property-based testing, going to come back, which is good. I feel like the test-driven development is making a comeback here.
Absolutely.
We are using a different set of tools now, but the fundamentals are still the same. So one thing I want to switch gear a little bit and talk about is obviously one of the things that Harry talked about is also becoming really, really important, that intent, the harness of the product, right? Now you all have specs. Now it really, really matters how you're fitting those specs in. So there are lots of interesting stuff happening in that, but that is your product now. The specs essentially become the product. So there is lots of stuff happening there. We should kind of take a look at that. Anything else he wants to share before we jump into next topic?
Not really. I think just to close off on the topic, most people ask me, what is this spec layer, right? If you think about when we spoke about what is a coding agent, like a Claude Code or an open code, there's an agent harness. And for me, spec-driven development or the Ralph loops and all of these things which are happening, this is technically the intent harness. It's helping us like take something nebulous, like the agent harness takes the raw potential of the LLM and makes that into a coding capability, the extraction of useful work. For me, the spec layer or the loop layer is largely the intent harness. It's harnessing your intuition, human intuition, to concrete intent articulation. So that's probably I'll stop with that.
Love that. Love that. That's awesome. So guys, go check out. There is a. I had that. So that's the open spec is an A implementation of that, right?
Yeah, it's
I will
one
share
of
the
the
link.
development tools. Yeah.
Okay. All right, I want to switch gear and talk about some new product releases that caught my attention this week or last couple of weeks. Obviously, one thing we should talk about is GPT 5.4. They have released it. Interestingly enough, I think first time they released as an only API only. Now later on, it actually made it to ChatGPT and other tools. There are a couple of, I've stopped paying attention to model releases, and Harry and I were talking about that before we went live here. Most of this feels like a very incremental, but there are a couple of things that caught my attention, Harry, that I wanted to share. One is that it has 1 million token context window. Like we all talking about context, right? Bigger context window, but I don't know whether they fundamentally solve the problem of forgetting the middle. I don't know, larger context window still feels like they fundamentally have the same problem. Models tend to forget stuff in that. Maybe they have. I haven't experienced, but you said you started using it. Are you getting any like a better results from GPT 5.4, or what's been your experience?
I haven't had any perceptible difference yet. Again, my primary purpose for using 5.4 has been spec authoring, and I use model. It's doing a good job though, but it's more perceptible or let's say anecdotal at this point. So I'm not really able to say like, this is a sea change from what was happening before, but maybe that's because of my limited use.
But you did mention the GPT 5.3 codex. These version numbers are so confusing, man. Why don't make it 5.4? So anyway, GPT 5.3 codex, that's been good for you, right?
Yeah, 5.3 codex, I certainly feel it. Like, the speed of what I was getting from like the earlier versions of codex or GPT for writing code itself was slightly, I can see a significant difference in terms of how perceptible it is, in terms of how accurate the first time. Previously, I would have to constantly, go back and what I want versus the steering was a little bit more. This requires less behavior notice that I've been able to notice with 5.3 codex. Again.
Okay. So one thing I've noticed here, I was about to, so glad I caught it. So they mentioned something that I thought was kind of interesting, saying this model essentially is released with built-in computer use capability. Okay. So a computer use made a huge splash when Claude came out with, you give a screenshot, it will tell you the coordinates, where to click button. Apparently it has a built-in sort of recognition of that. So you have to add a updated computer tool into the API, then essentially you can use this model to sort of drive your screens. but natively supported, which I thought was kind of interesting. Why bother to highlight that? But again, that's sort of interesting. Like, I'm with you, man. It doesn't make difference. I'm not going to blame. I do personally use at least 2 models when I'm bouncing ideas so that I don't get biasness. So my typical workflow looks like, don't laugh, it's a bit manual. So when I do, so lots of my context and research brainstorming happens in ChatGPT still. It's just my default, like my muscle memory now. So lots of my product development ideas and brainstorming processes, everything is sort of uploaded in the context. So that's why I go back to that context. Being context is the king. So anytime I use Claude Code for building and planning. Anytime I do planning, I sort of use ChatGPT or GPT 5.4 to sort of cross-validate. Use 2 models to bounce back and forth. This has been working very well for me. So one model makes a mistake, another model essentially catches them. But other than that, I haven't seen any drastic differences at all.
No, I think it's a very good way of using the models also, right? Like, and in fact, the more if you look at even the coding harnesses, they allow you to have the spec probably authored. This again going back to my use case. I usually have the spec authored by one model and have it reviewed by the other model, and find any gaps in it and highlight whether it's a warning or an error or critical issue, so that the other one can go and fix it. So the checks and balance is certainly good, and GPT certainly shines from a reasoning angle. That's always been the case for me, and versus Claude was always like the agent that is it's the model that is good at coding. So that 5.3 codec is slightly improving in that angle. So GPT has always been a favorite.
Yeah, I know. They get crap for a lot of stuff happening to OpenAI, but they create a good product. It's hard to see how they're having
merit of the model itself. Yeah, it seems to be okay.
Yeah. So next one I have on the list is now this is what sort of interesting, right? Excel is obviously the product that every business uses. It doesn't matter how many SaaS subscriptions they have. And I from a distance, I've never paid attention to this. Maybe we just mention it and move on. I don't find this interesting, but it's kind of fascinating to see how everybody's sort of competing for that space. So Microsoft obviously came up with a bunch of tools that automates the Excel. Claude has now. So essentially Claude desktop sort of chat interface kind of embeds on your Excel, because Excel has sort of app marketplace idea. And you can use Claude to manipulate your sales and stuff. Now, the interesting thing about this is that this does affect lots of that junior level job workflow stream sort of thing. Now an analyst can automate lots of stuff with Claude and Excel. They don't need to have a fancy dashboard, for an example. So, are you an Excel guy? Do you Excel a lot?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing which you mentioned is that use case, right? Like, for example, I don't have any shame in admitting it. I constantly struggle how to create a V table with Excel. I still have to Google for it or like search GPT for it, and then figure out what to do, and then I do it. It's just probably one of those things which I constantly forget. I know what I want done, but I don't know how to do it. And for me, being a CLI person, any clickety-clack UI interface is like very annoying. And if there is a sort of computer use sort of situation going on there, it will certainly help me. And that's helping me. So I'm not as dependent on other people to create reports and stuff. So certainly, yes, it probably impacts people who, for the most part, are talented at that, and their job was to get that done. So maybe it impacts them.
So there is, agree. I mean, I think these guys have created a much deeper integration, though. I think Excel has a marketplace idea. It's kind of interesting to see, because I remember when I was part of an accelerator, there was another company was trying to do something with Excel. Wish I knew this, I would have told them, do this. They were having a hard time to have people migrate from using Excel. Their target user base was heavy Excel users, and move them from using Excel to their application. which is always really, really hard, right? Meet where your users are is always a
Yeah.
better way to get your product in. So that if you're building something for Excel, might as well embed it in Excel. So the next one I thought was another sort of a heated competition going on is that whole Anthropic Cowork. So Anthropic released a desktop version of Claude Code, essentially wrapped in a fancy. It's a part of Claude Desktop, sorry, which has it's Cowork because it has a set of plugins that you can connect to. That means it can connect to your. Obviously, it can access your browser. It can connect to all of your Office products, and suddenly you have this tool that can automate a bunch of workflow. Obviously, it's a huge problem space that everybody has to go after because any enterprise organization have this kind of set of tools. So I've noticed that Microsoft is obviously going after, which is sort of interesting. Microsoft owning all the Office products. It's fascinating to see how much Claude is making runway into this space and sort of essentially competing head on head with Microsoft. But Google also came up with something like this. I did use Cowork and for one challenge, and it was fascinating to me how it worked, dude. So maybe I should not mention the deal. So anyway, I was trying to scrape a website. Okay. There was a bunch of business contacts that I was after because I want to reach out to them. But obviously, this website is managed very old school, lots of pages, hundreds of pages with links and all that. I wanted to build an app to sort of scrape that for me. But obviously, scraping with Claude Code would be that it will write some code, Python code, which will playwright or what have you, open the Chrome browser and add it. It's always clunky. Whenever I saw it, I find it hard. So I said, hey, Cowork can do that. I connected Cowork with my Chrome. It has a way to do that using plugin. And just gave an instruction. It actually came up with a better plan to extract those contacts. Extracted those contacts, saved them in a file. It has connection to, obviously, my file system, which is another important thing. Then exported that into an Excel. Within an hour, I had this whole contacts script out, nicely formatted in my Excel document.
I think the interesting thing that struck out to me, again, was an observation which someone else made, is that Claude, when it started out with your file system access, and then it went to browser. So it has a lot more access to what you can do, and it has a little bit more power to, influence your work, versus the other tools were primarily on the browser, and then they were coming down to your system the other way around. And that's one. The second thing is, the Claude Code was a general purpose agent. It was never something specific to coding. It was just general purpose, and they were learning all the way along. And all they had to do is repurpose the coding general purpose agent to do your regular desktop chores. And it took off from there. And so practically it can do coding, and it can do desktop access. And it can do not just computer access, maybe it can do other things also, general purpose machine access. So
you brought up something that lots of people have been talking about too, right? I mean, there is a reason why every AI lab is essentially trying to build a coding engine, because coding, I feel like at some point, if you step back and think coding agent is the only agent you need.
Yeah.
Because everything else is sort of a search problem, right? I mean, I need this app to be built that will do this, and coding agent can specialize, figure out what the problem is, and kind of build that for you, right?
My take there is my understanding is it's a little domain specific, right? What we are trying to do is maybe I don't want to see the ugliness of the code that is being generated. Maybe I don't want to see that there is an app being generated. So I want to stay domain specific, and probably it just lives on my mobile phone, and it probably coordinates across multiple apps and does something for me. Maybe underneath, like what you said, it's writing some code to coordinate between these applications, but net effect, what I see is it's a desktop agent or a mobile agent, or it's a Cowork or Co-Mobile or something like that. Maybe just being domain specific.
Right. Yeah, fascinating to see that. Yeah, makes sense. All right, there are a couple of stories in here. one thing that we should talk about is just to switch gears here a little bit. So there has been some recent reports of Amazon crashes, and I think that their website was crashed, and AWS also there has been crashed last week. And Amazon apparently called. I'm not going to share the story link for this because this is somebody commenting on. I haven't validated with this, so this is true. But the SIS crashes were true. Then they apparently had like all hands meeting with all the engineers trying to figure out what happened. It turned out that most of these crashes was happening because they've been Amazon's coding agent is called Kiro, I think. Kiro. So
Kiro
developers were encouraged.
Kiro is the spec-driven development tool that I started with, and Kiro CLI is the I think they have a model Q or something. If I forget, if I'm not wrong.
Oh, well, Amazon Q developer. Thank you. Q, yeah, they've been forcing their developers, Amazon developers, to use Q to automate that much of their development life cycles. So lots of this crashes has been attributed to that tool because tool pushed something in production which had a bug and sort of crashed a bunch of stuff. So December 2025, they have a tool called Kiro as well. Maybe I should look it up. Caused a 13-hour AWS outage. So this goes back to sort of saying Kiro.dev. Yeah, there is a tool called Kiro.dev AWS uses. Let me share the screen here a little bit. The reason for doing this is that this is what they're trying to force their developers to use. And the force may be a strong word in here, maybe encouraged, what have you, but people were getting measured in terms of this. And this sort of brings up in sort of fun. Obviously, lots of developers who are still skeptic about this are having a field day around this, right? They're having tons of fun. See, this is what happens when you push an AI and nobody reviews it. And then a review is impossible for all this thousand lines of code that's getting generated. Things gonna go back, right? I mean, crash happened when you said, right? Humans also makes mistake. But one thing sort of highlights here though, right? I mean, if you, without sort of planning, force teams to, I mean, this is what's happening in industry right now, right? Every company has an AI strategy. And part of this AI strategy is that how quickly we can have people start using these tools without sort of understanding the trade-offs in here of what to give, how to properly use this tool, maybe include spec-driven development so you don't catch stuff like that. What's you been, I know you do lots of consulting with other clients too. I mean, do you see that's happening very top down, but developers are not very sure about these tools?
Yeah, in fact, it kind of fully does a full circle to that article which we started with. The whole point of that article at enterprise scale, the single liner for that is it's not a technical rollout, it's a cultural shift in terms of how people have to adopt it, right? The biggest problem I see with any rollout, be it spec-driven development or generally AI coding, is it's seen more of a tooling rollout. And if just looking at engineers asking for it or doing it, one, there's obviously like pushback and there is resistance and whatnot. A second is trying to force it into or shoehorn it into the existing organizational structure, and then having individual people say like, I'll just improve the productivity of the person. It doesn't really work that well. Thanks for bringing up this article. Like Kiro itself was one of my favorite tools. Even now I use it in the sense that it's the first tool where I came to know about spec-driven development. It introduced the whole concept of like, going logically about it. My take here, my understanding so far in terms of my experience has been that the less you look at it as just technology related change and just some dial you can turn on to have engineers adopt it and suddenly you have magical superpowers is probably the as the equivalent of spec fall or the scrum fall, which I'm comparing in that article. But it's not a you don't want it to be in the situation of like just adopting it for the sake of adopting the whole equation changes in terms of how people interact with each other and how people interact with the AI itself. So
so this is exactly what I was worried about. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, this is not a tool change. It's not you're introducing introducing a developer tool or new ID that they all have to use. This is fundamentally changes how we've been building software for years. Absolutely right. I mean, that's why it's so important to identify a few champions within the organization and have them sort of show you their workflow. Like have people like you go in there and kind of say, hey, I've been doing both sides, and I'll show you how I changed my style and workflow, right? And we gotta adapt, we gotta figure it out, right? But this whole idea of, I see in my notes in here, I just skimmed through that. The new rule they have introduced. If anyone from AWS works at Amazon listening to this, please, I could be wrong here. Please correct me if you know this better, or if maybe you're not allowed to correct. So junior and mid-level engineers now need senior sign-off and AI assistant production changes. So any code that's generated by AI, which I'm assuming every code line, now needs to get verified by a senior engineer. This is too much. If you're a senior engineer now, I mean, your responsibility is like crazy. The one bug or production down goes through your sort of queue, you're going to be held responsible. This is not scalable.
The review burden is immense. Like I think
this is crazy.
People I talk to, I think the senior engineers especially, or like the tech leads, that role is the one which is under the most burden at the moment, at least in what I have seen in my limited experience, is that they feel like I adopt this and everyone in my team adopts this. I'm finally responsible for the code that gets shipped out. So I have to read every line of code, and each PR these days is nothing short of like 1,000 lines, and I don't know what I should do. That's the issue. Of course, then the answer to that is automated review, but again, like, that's like a magical answer to automated review to automated code. Then, but finally, it's still my neck on the line. So how do I make that decision then?
Yeah, it's crazy. We can end here. If is there any other topic or stories you want to cover?
Not really, but I think just recalling some of the points that you mentioned, Neil. What struck me from today's conversation is, while like some of us are still looking at, again, this is a learning for me also, right? Like when you go into the spec-driven development or like AI coding, we tend to lose track of what is the realistic world about actual coding, the joy of coding itself. And sometimes I myself like reflect and look at it as, suddenly is code become that art form which I'm like I can practice in my personal time, like calligraphy, because I probably like to write, but if I have to actually do the work which is more industrial and production, then I just have to type it out and mechanically get out of it. So I don't know, like the art form of software engineering is still very much retained, but to your point, can I and be comfortable with it? That's a point I'm going to be like, that's still lingering in my head, and I probably need to think a little bit more about it. So calling that out.
So it's I think that's a good way to say it. I mean, I wonder about that too. The joy is probably, there is a joy when you see what you're building is sort of working. You see the final product is obviously joy, but there was also the day-to-day joy of sort of unpacking each other, designing a beautiful interface, stuff like that. I don't get that anymore. I don't. Sometimes it feels like work, which is not good. But I'm sure, I mean, there are lots of problems to be solved. Like I say, I mean, I get excited about thinking about, hey, how can I automate the validation stuff? There's lots of exciting innovation needs to be done there. So there are still new problems to be go after, right? So that's
someone
something
like
I
me
look forward to.
I mean, like, sorry, someone like me who's always been challenged with building UI or anything there. I've always been felt limited because that skill is something that I lack. But now after AI, I've been able to build stuff very quickly, right? So for the ones
they're good, right? Claude is really good at UX. I feel
and you just put the design plugin in, and you can like spin out things as quickly as. I don't know. I have not built a site.
Have you looked at pencil.dev? Have you looked at pencil.dev?
Yes, I use Pencil.
That looks good. Okay.
And all of these tools, I think, have immensely improved my personal productivity, and my ability to independently ship has improved. versus
for sure.
previously I was dependent on others, and like, even now I get their expert
Agree.
opinion, but nevertheless
Agree.
I'm able to not be hamstrung by my own limitations of being largely backend and distributed systems person. I can do anything
That's
that
joy, right? That's fun.
yeah, that's
That's
definitely
fun.
fun.
Oh, there you go. There you go. We still have fun. Thank you, Harry. It's wonderful. I know it's late there, but thanks for staying up. As always, it's a lovely discussion. I would like to have you back again some point.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And
Yeah.
I missed Derek this time, and hopefully next time we'll catch up with him and we'll
Yeah.
have a good chat with him.
Okay. Absolutely.
Thank
All
you,
right, take
Neil.
care. Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.